All right, so are you ready to like take your English speaking skills to the next level?
Mm,
And not just textbook perfect, but the kind of fluency that makes you feel confident in any situation.
that's what we're talking about today.
Yeah, well, you've come to the right place because this deep dive is all about unlocking those next level speaking skills.
Mm.
We've been digging into this popular podcast episode, and they call them English speaking hacks.
Yeah.
And let me tell you, some of these are seriously mind blowing. I mean,
What I think is so fascinating about these hacks is that they're not just like surface level tips. They're grounded in like the psychology and science of language learning. So we're going to uncover not only what works, but also the why behind it.
yeah, and that's going to help you personalize these strategies and make them your own. So,
Exactly.
okay, let's start with something that might surprise you. The first hack is all about embracing imperfection. You know that feeling of dread when you make a mistake while speaking?
Oh, yeah.
Well, this hack turns that on its head.
It does. It really does. The podcast argues that mistakes are not the enemy. In fact, they're your secret weapon.
Okay.
But it's not just about accepting them, it's about reframing how you view them entirely.
Right.
Think of it this way. Each mistake is actually valuable data for your brain. It highlights the gaps in your knowledge and helps you focus your practice more effectively.
That makes sense, but how does that actually work in practice? Because I know I used to get so flustered when I mess up.
Right.
It just threw off my whole conversation.
Here's where the psychology comes in. When you're constantly afraid of making mistakes, your brain goes into like fight or flight mode. You overthink, you hesitate, and your fluency suffers.
Yeah.
But when you embrace mistakes as a natural part of the process, you free up your brain to focus on communication instead of perfection.
So it's like switching from a judgmental inner critic to a more supportive coach.
Yes.
Instead of beating yourself up for errors, you can use them as stepping stones to improve.
Precisely. And the more you practice this mindset, the less those mistakes will bother you, and the more you'll be able to actually learn from them. It creates a positive feedback loop that boosts your confidence and accelerates your learning.
So, okay, I'm starting to see how powerful this shift in perspective can be. But for our listener out there who's maybe still struggling with this fear of making mistakes, what's a good first step to put this into action?
Start small. Find a safe space to practice where you feel comfortable making mistakes. It could be talking to yourself, practicing with a language partner, or even recording yourself speaking. The key is to create an environment where you can experiment freely without the pressure of judgment.
That's great advice. Now, speaking of practice, let's move on to the next hack, which is all about shadowing. I think a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with this technique,
Yeah.
but the podcast we analyzed offered some interesting insights that I think are worth exploring.
Yes, the podcast used this fun analogy of becoming a linguistic parrot, which
Yeah.
I thought was a pretty accurate description.
I like.
But beyond just mimicking shadowing is really a powerful way to internalize the natural rhythm and flow of English. It goes beyond just pronunciation and helps you absorb the nuances of intonation, stress, and even emotional expression.
So it's not just about sounding like a native speaker. It's about understanding the musicality of the language.
Right.
Like I remember when I first started learning a language other than English, I could read and write fairly well, but my speaking sounded so robotic.
Yes.
It wasn't until I started paying attention to the rhythm and intonation that it started to feel more natural.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. It's like learning to dance. You can learn the steps from a book, but to really move with grace and fluidity, you need to feel the music to sense the rhythm. Shadowing helps you develop that sense of rhythm in English.
I love that analogy. Now, I'm curious about the science behind this. How does mimicking someone else's speech actually lead to this deeper understanding?
Well, research has shown that when we imitate someone, our brains activate what are called mirror neurons. These neurons fire both when we perform an action ourselves and when we observe someone else performing that same action. So when you're shadowing, your brain is essentially practicing speaking English, even though you're not actually producing the words yourself.
Wow, that's incredible. So it's like your brain is getting a workout without even realizing it. It's almost like a form of passive learning, but much more engaging.
Exactly. And this is why even short bursts of shadowing can be surprisingly effective. The key, as with anything, is consistency. Even just 10 to 15 minutes a day can make a significant difference over time.
And I think that's really encouraging for our listeners to hear. You don't have to spend hours and hours on this. Just a little bit each day can really move the needle.
Absolutely. And the great thing about shadowing is that you can do it with virtually any audio or video material. Find something you enjoy listening to, a podcast, a TV show, an audiobook, and just try to mimic the speaker as closely as possible.
And don't be afraid to experiment. Try shadowing different accents, different speaking styles, different genres. The more variety you expose yourself to, the more well-rounded your speaking skills will become.
I agree. Now let's move on to a hack that's all about expanding your vocabulary in a more effective way. You see, many language learners get stuck in the trap of just memorizing individual words.
Yeah,
But this hack encourages us to think bigger. It's about focusing on phrases instead.
that's interesting. I know I've definitely been guilty of relying too heavily on my trusty dictionary.
We all do.
But why are phrases so important? What makes them more effective than just learning individual words?
Well, think of phrases as the building blocks of natural speech. They convey meaning in a more nuanced and contextualized way.
Okay.
While individual words are important, it's the way they're combined into phrases that truly unlocks fluency and allows you to express yourself more naturally.
So it's not just about knowing what words mean in isolation, but understanding how they work together to create meaning.
Exactly. Let's take a simple example from the podcast. Instead of just learning the word happy, you could learn phrases like over the moon or on cloud nine. These phrases not only enrich your vocabulary, but also teach you about the subtle shades of meaning and how to use words in different situations.
That makes so much sense. It's like learning the difference between saying, I'm happy and I'm ecstatic. They both convey happiness, but the phrase adds a level of intensity and emotion that the single word doesn't quite capture.
Precisely. And the more phrases you learn, the more you'll start to notice these patterns and internalize the subtle ways in which English speakers express themselves.
So, this is where I want to challenge our listener. Think about some common emotions or ideas that you want to express in English. Instead of just relying on the basic translation, try to brainstorm some more colorful and expressive phrases that convey the same meaning.
That's a great challenge. And here's another tip. Pay attention to phrases used in different contexts. For example, the way you express happiness in a formal setting might be different from how you'd express it among friends.
That's such a good point. It's all about adapting your language to the situation.
Now, this leads us to a topic that many English learners find intimidating: grammar.
I think we can all relate to feeling overwhelmed by grammar rules at some point.
Absolutely. But this next hack offers a refreshing perspective. It encourages us to reframe grammar as a tool, not a rule book.
So instead of getting bogged down in memorizing all the rules, it's more about understanding how grammar functions in real-world communication.
Exactly. The podcast we analyzed emphasized the power of observation and pattern recognition. Instead of drilling yourself on verb tenses, for example, try listening for how native speakers use them naturally in conversation. Pay attention to the context, the time expressions, the overall structure of the sentences.
So it's like learning to cook by watching a master chef, right? Instead of memorizing every recipe, you observe their techniques, you see how they combine ingredients, and you gradually develop an intuitive understanding of the process.
That's a fantastic analogy. And this approach to grammar not only makes it more enjoyable, but also more effective. Because you're learning through real-world examples, you're less likely to forget the rules and more likely to use them correctly in your own speech.
This is where I think active listening becomes really important. It's not just about hearing English. It's about actively engaging with it and paying attention to those subtle nuances of grammar and usage.
You're absolutely right. Active listening is an essential skill for any language learner. It helps you develop a deeper understanding of how the language works in practice, which in turn improves your speaking skills.
The podcast shared some great techniques for practicing active listening. What are some of the ones that stood out to you?
One that I found particularly helpful is watching movies or TV shows with subtitles.
Oh, yeah.
It allows you to connect the spoken words with their written form, which can be incredibly beneficial for improving your comprehension and vocabulary.
That's something I've always found useful as well. And it can also be a fun way to learn new idioms and slang expressions.
Absolutely. Another great technique is pausing and repeating what you hear. This forces you to slow down and really focus on the pronunciation, intonation, and grammar.
It's almost like breaking down the language into smaller pieces, right? So you can really analyze each element and understand how it fits into the larger whole.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of prediction. As you're listening, try to anticipate what the speaker will say next based on the context.
Okay.
This keeps your brain actively engaged and helps you develop a more intuitive understanding of the language.
It's like solving a puzzle, right? You're piecing together clues to figure out the meaning.
Precisely. And if you're listening to something particularly challenging, don't hesitate to use audio slowing apps. They can help you break down speech without distorting it, making it easier to catch every word.
Great tips. I think this highlights the importance of being proactive in your listening. It's not just about passively absorbing information. It's about actively engaging with the language and making it a more immersive experience.
You've hit the nail on the head. And speaking of immersive experiences, that brings us to the next hack, which is all about creating your own English world, even if you don't live in an English-speaking country.
This is where things get really interesting, because I think a lot of people assume that immersion requires traveling abroad. But the podcast we analyzed shared some incredibly creative ways to achieve that same level of immersion right from home.
Right. It's all about making English a more integral part of your daily life. One of the simplest but most effective ways to do this is to change the language settings on your phone and computer to English.
I've heard of this technique before, but honestly, I was always a little hesitant to try it. I thought it might be too confusing or overwhelming. But now that I think about it, it's such a clever way to constantly expose yourself to the language without even realizing it.
Exactly. You'll start noticing English everywhere you look, from menus to app notifications to social media posts. It's like creating a constant stream of English input throughout your day.
And that's where the magic of immersion really happens, right? When you're surrounded by the language, it starts to seep into your subconscious and you start to think and process information in English more naturally.
Precisely. But immersion is not just about passive exposure, it's about actively engaging with the language as well. Think about your interests and hobbies. How can you incorporate English into them?
That's a great question. If you enjoy watching movies, switch to English subtitles. If you love listening to music, start listening to English songs and try to understand the lyrics. If you're a gamer, try playing video games in English.
Exactly. The possibilities are endless. The key is to find activities that you genuinely enjoy and make English a part of them.
And don't underestimate the power of social media. You can follow English-speaking influencers, join online communities, or even participate in language exchange groups.
That's a great point. Social media can be such a valuable tool for connecting with native speakers and other learners from around the world. It allows you to practice your English in a more relaxed and informal setting.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive, but I want to leave our listeners with a few key takeaways to ponder. We started by talking about the importance of embracing imperfection and reframing mistakes as opportunities for growth.
Right. It's all about shifting your mindset from fear to curiosity. Instead of letting mistakes hold you back, use them as fuel to propel your learning forward.
And we explored the power of shadowing, not just as a pronunciation tool, but as a way to internalize the rhythm and flow of English.
Absolutely.
We delved into the importance of learning phrases instead of just individual words, recognizing that phrases are the building blocks of natural speech and allow you to express yourself more authentically.
Right.
And finally, we talked about the transformative power of immersion and how you can create your own English world even if you can't travel abroad.
Absolutely. It's about making English a more integral part of your daily life, finding ways to integrate it into your hobbies and interests, and actively seeking out opportunities to engage with the language.
We'll be back in a moment to continue our exploration of these incredible English-speaking hacks. Welcome back to our deep dive into English-speaking hacks.
We're picking up right where we left off, exploring those strategies that can really make a difference in your fluency and confidence.
And I'm especially excited about this next section because we're going to delve deeper into something we touched on earlier, grammar.
Yes, we talked about reframing grammar as a tool rather than a rule book, and now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of how to actually put that into practice.
You know, I think a lot of learners, myself included, have a bit of a love-hate relationship with grammar. On the one hand, we know it's important for clear communication, but on the other hand, it can feel so overwhelming and tedious at times.
I completely understand. But what if I told you that grammar could actually be fun and even fascinating?
Okay, now you've got my attention. Tell me more.
Well, the podcast we analyzed really opened my eyes to the beauty of grammar. It's not just about memorizing a bunch of rules, it's about understanding the underlying structure of the language, the patterns and relationships that create meaning.
So it's like seeing the skeleton beneath the surface, the framework that holds everything together.
Exactly. And once you start to see those patterns, grammar becomes less about rote memorization and more about intuitive understanding.
That's a much more appealing way to think about it. But how do we actually make that shift from memorizing rules to recognizing patterns?
One of the most powerful techniques is simply paying attention to how native speakers use grammar in natural conversation.
So it's about observation rather than just studying textbooks.
Precisely. Listen to how native speakers structure their sentences, how they use different tenses, how they connect ideas.
It's almost like being a detective, right?
Yeah.
Looking for clues and patterns to unlock the mystery of the language.
I love that analogy. And here's a tip, focus on one specific grammar point at a time.
So instead of trying to master everything at once, pick one area and really dive deep.
Exactly. Let's say you're struggling with the conditional tense. Instead of trying to memorize all the different forms and rules, listen for how native speakers use it in real-life situations. Pay attention to the context, the time expressions, the subtle nuances of meaning.
And then maybe try to imitate those patterns in your own speaking.
Absolutely. You can even try shadowing sentences that use the conditional tense, mimicking the pronunciation and intonation.
That's a great idea. And it ties back to what we talked about earlier, embracing imperfection. Because as you're experimenting with these new grammar patterns, you're bound to make mistakes.
And that's perfectly okay. In fact, it's essential for learning. Each mistake is an opportunity to refine your understanding and get closer to mastery.
So it's like a dance between observation and experimentation, constantly refining your steps until you find your own rhythm.
Beautifully put. And speaking of practice, let's move on to a hack that might seem a bit unconventional at first, self-talk.
Ah, yes, the art of talking to yourself.
No.
I have to admit, I used to feel a little self-conscious about doing this, but the podcast we analyzed really emphasized its effectiveness.
It might seem strange at first, but there's actually a lot of science to support the benefits of self-talk for language learning.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for me.
Well, when you talk to yourself in English, you're essentially creating a safe space to practice without any external pressure or judgment.
So it's like having a private rehearsal before the big performance.
Exactly. You can experiment with different vocabulary, grammar structures, and pronunciation without the fear of making mistakes in front of others.
And because you're not worried about being judged, you're more likely to relax and let your natural personality shine through.
Precisely. It allows you to focus on the process of communication rather than the fear of evaluation.
But how do we actually make self-talk effective? Do we just ramble on about whatever comes to mind?
While free-flowing self-talk can be helpful, it's also important to be intentional about what you practice.
So maybe set some goals for each self-talk session, like today I'm going to focus on using the conditional tense, or I'm going to try to describe my day using more descriptive vocabulary.
Exactly. And you can also use self-talk to prepare for specific situations. For example, if you have an important presentation coming up, practice your speech out loud to yourself beforehand.
That's a great tip. And it reminds me of another hack we'll be discussing later, recording yourself. But for now, let's stick with self-talk. What are some other ways our listeners can incorporate this into their daily routines?
One simple but effective technique is to narrate your actions as you go about your day.
It's like I'm making breakfast now. I'm walking to the bus stop. I'm listening to my favorite podcast.
Exactly. It might feel silly at first, but it's a great way to get your brain thinking in English and to practice using everyday vocabulary in a natural context.
It's something you could do literally anywhere, anytime. No special equipment or preparation required.
Precisely. And as you become more comfortable with self-talk, you can start having imaginary conversations in English.
Oh, that's a fun idea. Like pretending to have a conversation with a friend or colleague.
Exactly. It's a great way to practice using different social expressions and to prepare for real-life interactions.
So self-talk is all about creating that immersive English environment within your own mind, even when you're not actively studying or interacting with others.
You got it. And speaking of immersive environments, that brings us back to another powerful hack we discussed earlier, recording yourself.
Yes, recording yourself can be a bit intimidating at first,
Yeah.
but I think it's one of the most valuable tools for self-assessment and improvement.
I couldn't agree more. It allows you to step back and listen to your speech objectively, almost as if you were listening to someone else.
It's like having a personal language coach in your pocket. But sometimes I find it hard to be objective when listening to my own recordings. Any tips for making the most of this technique?
Absolutely. First, choose a topic that you're comfortable talking about, something that genuinely interests you.
So it could be anything from describing your hobbies to discussing current events to sharing a personal story.
Exactly. The key is to choose something that will allow you to speak naturally and spontaneously.
Then maybe set a timer for a few minutes and just start talking like you would in a casual conversation.
Precisely. Don't overthink it. Just let the words flow.
And once you've recorded yourself, what should you be listening for?
Pay attention to your pronunciation, intonation, and overall fluency. Are there any words or sounds that you're struggling with? Are there any grammar structures that you're using incorrectly?
So it's like a diagnostic tool helping you pinpoint specific areas that need improvement.
Exactly. And don't just focus on your weaknesses. Also note your strengths. What are you doing well? What aspects of your speaking are you proud of?
That's such a good point. It's easy to get caught up in what we're doing wrong, but it's equally important to acknowledge our progress and celebrate our successes.
Absolutely. Recognizing your achievements, no matter how small, can be a powerful motivator.
Now, one thing I've always wondered about recording myself is how to compare my speech to that of native speakers. Is there a way to do that effectively?
There are several approaches you can take. One option is to find recordings of native speakers online. There are many websites and apps that offer audio and video samples of people speaking English in different accents and contexts.
So you could listen to a podcast or watch a YouTube video and then try to mimic the speaker's pronunciation and intonation.
Exactly. You can also use language learning apps or websites that offer speech analysis tools. These tools can provide feedback on your pronunciation, intonation, and fluency, helping you pinpoint specific areas for improvement.
That sounds incredibly helpful. But I think it's important to remember that the goal isn't necessarily to sound exactly like a native speaker, but rather to communicate clearly and effectively.
Couldn't agree more. It's about developing your own unique voice in English while ensuring that your message is understood.
And that brings us to another crucial aspect of language learning motivation.
Staying motivated is key. especially when you're tackling something as challenging as mastering a new language.
And let's face it, language learning can be a marathon, not a sprint. There will be times when you feel discouraged or frustrated.
Absolutely. And that's where setting micro goals can be incredibly helpful.
I love this concept. It's about breaking down those big, overwhelming goals into smaller, more manageable steps.
Precisely. Instead of focusing on the daunting task of becoming fluent, focus on achieving smaller milestones along the way.
For example, instead of saying, I want to be fluent in English, set a goal to learn 10 new phrases this week or to have a 5-minute conversation in English every day.
Exactly. These micro goals create a sense of accomplishment and keep you moving forward even when progress seems slow.
And they also make it easier to track your progress and celebrate your successes along the way.
Absolutely. It's like climbing a mountain. If you only focus on the summit, it can seem impossibly far away. But if you break it down into smaller base camps along the way, each one becomes a victory.
That's such a great analogy. But how do we ensure that our micro goals are actually effective? What should we keep in mind when setting them?
One helpful framework is to think of SMART goals: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound.
Okay, I like that. So, specific means that the goal is clearly defined, measurable, means that you can track your progress. Achievable means that it's realistic. Relevant means that it aligns with your overall language learning objectives. And time bound means that it has a deadline.
You got it. For example, instead of saying, I want to improve my pronunciation, set a goal to practice pronouncing the th sound for 10 minutes every day for a week.
That's much more specific and actionable. And as you achieve each micro goal, you build momentum and motivation to keep going.
Exactly. It's like a positive feedback loop. Each small victory fuels your desire to achieve the next one.
Now, besides setting SMART goals, what are some other ways our listeners can stay motivated on their language learning journey?
One powerful technique is to find ways to make language learning fun and engaging.
This is where your personal interests and hobbies come in, right?
Absolutely. If you enjoy watching movies, watch them in English with subtitles. If you love music, listen to English songs and try to sing along. If you're a gamer, play video games in English.
The possibilities are endless. The key is to find activities that you genuinely enjoy and incorporate English into them.
Exactly. Make language learning feel less like a chore and more like a natural part of your life.
And I think that's a great segue into our next section, which is all about immersion.
Yes, immersion is all about surrounding yourself with the language as much as possible, even if you don't live in an English-speaking country.
And the good news is that there are countless ways to create an immersive environment right from home.
Absolutely. One simple technique is to change the language settings on your phone, computer, and other devices to English.
That's such a clever way to constantly expose yourself to the language without even realizing it. You'll start noticing English words and phrases everywhere you look.
Exactly. And as you become more familiar with the language, you'll find it easier to understand and use it in your own conversations.
But immersion is not just about passive exposure, right? It's also about actively seeking out opportunities to engage with the language.
You're absolutely right. Try to have conversations with native speakers or other learners, even if it's just for a few minutes at a time.
Join online communities or forums where English is the primary language. Attend English-speaking events in your local area. The more you use the language, the more comfortable and confident you'll become.
Couldn't agree more. And speaking of confidence, that brings us to a hack that can be truly transformative: embracing imperfection.
This is something we've touched on throughout our discussion, but I think it's worth emphasizing again because it's so fundamental to successful language learning.
Absolutely. The podcast we analyzed shared some incredible stories about learners who were able to achieve fluency by letting go of their fear of making mistakes.
And I think that's so important for our listeners to hear because perfectionism can be such a roadblock to progress.
It can be paralyzing. But when you embrace imperfection, you free yourself to experiment, to take risks, to learn from your mistakes.
And ultimately, that's what language learning is all about, right? It's about the journey, not the destination. It's about constantly evolving, adapting, and refining your skills.
Beautifully said. And speaking of journeys, we've covered a lot of ground in this second part of our deep dive. We've explored practical techniques for mastering grammar, harnessing the power of self-talk, utilizing recordings for self-assessment, setting SMART goals for motivation, and creating an immersive English environment.
And through it all, we've emphasized the importance of embracing imperfection and seeing mistakes as valuable opportunities for growth.
Now, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, we'd like to leave you with a question to ponder.
Of all the hacks and strategies we've discussed today, which one resonates with you the most?
Which technique are you most excited to try out?
We encourage you to take a moment to reflect on this question and see how you can apply these insights to your own language learning journey.
And we'll be back in just a moment to explore some final thoughts and insights.
Welcome back to the deep dive.
We're in the final stretch of our exploration of English-speaking hacks, and I'm really excited to wrap things up by diving into some strategies that can truly transform your relationship with the language.
I'm with you there. We've talked about so many practical tips, but now feels like we're moving into the realm of mindset and long-term habits.
Exactly. And one of the most powerful shifts you can make is to fully embrace the concept of immersion, even if you're not living in an English-speaking country.
We touched on this earlier, but I think it's worth circling back to because it's such a game changer. The podcast we analyzed really hammered home the point that you can create an incredibly rich, immersive experience right where you are.
It's all about being intentional and making English a more integrated part of your daily life. Sometimes it's the simplest things that have the biggest impact. For example, just changing the language settings on your phone and computer can make a world of difference.
I've heard people say that before, but I'll admit I always thought it might be more trouble than it's worth. But now that you mention it, it makes so much sense. It's like passively absorbing the language throughout your day.
Think about it. Instead of just seeing English during your dedicated study time, you're now encountering it in your everyday tasks, reading emails, scrolling through social media, navigating apps. It becomes much more ingrained.
And it's not just about reading, it's about getting comfortable with English in a more functional way. You're forced to think in English to complete tasks, which can be a really effective way to break down those mental barriers.
Absolutely. It pushes you outside of your comfort zone in a very gentle way. But immersion is not just about those little digital nudges. It's also about surrounding yourself with English language media in a way that feels exciting, not like a chore.
Yes, it's about finding things you genuinely enjoy. Movies, TV shows, music, podcasts, books, articles, whatever sparks your interest.
I think that's a crucial point. If you're forcing yourself to consume content you find boring, it's going to feel like work. But if you find things that captivate you, that draw you in, the learning happens almost effortlessly.
It's like the difference between studying a textbook and getting lost in a good novel. One feels like an obligation, the other feels like an adventure.
Exactly. And when you're immersed in a story, a song, a podcast episode, you're not just passively listening or reading, you're actively engaged. Your brain is firing on all cylinders.
And that's where the real magic of immersion happens. You start to internalize the rhythms, the nuances, the expressions. It becomes less about consciously studying and more about intuitively absorbing the language.
And the beauty of it is that you can tailor it to your interests. Are you a history buff? Dive into documentaries and historical fiction? Are you a science nerd? Listen to science podcasts and read articles about the latest discoveries. Make it personal.
And don't be afraid to challenge yourself a little. Start with material that's maybe slightly below your level so you can really enjoy the experience without getting bogged down in unfamiliar vocabulary. Then as you progress, gradually increase the difficulty.
That's a great strategy. It's about finding that sweet spot between comfort and challenge where you're engaged but not overwhelmed.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that immersion is not just about passive consumption. It's also about finding opportunities to actively use the language.
Couldn't agree more. Seek out those chances to speak with native speakers or other learners, even if it's just for a few minutes at a time.
Join online communities or forums where English is the primary language. Attend English-speaking events in your local area. The more you use the language in real-life situations, the more confident and fluent you become.
It's all about building that muscle memory, getting comfortable with the natural flow of conversation.
And this brings us back to a theme we've been emphasizing throughout this deep dive: embracing imperfection.
Yes. Letting go of that fear of making mistakes is absolutely crucial for making the most of immersion.
Because, let's face it, when you're interacting with others, mistakes are inevitable. And that's okay. It's all part of the process.
The podcast we analyzed shared a really inspiring anecdote about a learner who was terrified of speaking English. She had a perfect understanding of grammar and a vast vocabulary, but she was so afraid of making mistakes that she refused to speak.
Oh, I can relate to that.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us have that inner critic holding us back.
But her language coach encouraged her to embrace her imperfections and to start speaking, even if it meant making mistakes. And guess what? It was a breakthrough moment for her.
I bet once you break through that barrier of fear, it's like a whole new world opens up.
Exactly. She started to relax and enjoy the process of speaking, and her fluency improved dramatically. It's a powerful reminder that mistakes are not the enemy. They're actually valuable stepping stones to fluency.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's like that saying, the master has failed more times than the beginner has even tried.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So our message to you, dear listener, is this: embrace your imperfections. Don't let the fear of making mistakes hold you back. Jump into those immersive experiences, start those conversations, and allow yourself to learn and grow from every interaction.
And remember, fluency is not a destination, it's a journey. There will be ups and downs, moments of frustration, and moments of triumph. But the most important thing is to keep moving forward, to keep exploring, to keep challenging yourself.
And to find joy in the process, because language learning should be an adventure, not a chore.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into English speaking hacks, we want to leave you with a call to action. Choose one or two of the strategies that resonated with you the most and commit to putting them into practice this week.
Don't wait for the perfect moment. Just start. Take that first step. Embrace the challenge and see where this incredible journey takes you.
We're confident that with dedication, curiosity, and a willingness to embrace imperfection, you can achieve your English-speaking goals and unlock a whole new world of possibilities.
Absolutely. And remember, we're all in this together. So keep practicing, keep exploring, and keep sharing your discoveries with the world.
This is host speaker
An expert speaker.
signing off for now.